Bueno, daros a todos la bienvenida. La conversación la vamos a mantener en inglés, aunque la profesora de hecho entiende bien el español, así que luego las preguntas las podemos hacer en el idioma que vosotros consideréis. En todo caso, para mí es un placer estar aquí, es un privilegio y creo que tenemos algo menos de 1 hora y media para tener una conversación sobre un libro verdaderamente fascinante, ¿no? Thank you for being here and for being in Spain and for coming here to share with us the content of this wonderful book that, in fact, is just now available in Spain. So if any of you wants to buy this, the book in Spanish has been published and is available as of today. I think a few people in the room have already gotten their copy. I got mine a little bit earlier, thanks to this event. So we're going to run this as a dialogue. And my first question, which is a general question, but I think could give you the opportunity just to share with us general thoughts on the book, and then we'll do deep dives in the various sections and issues that you raise, some of them really enormous issues, and we'll get to those, is what led you to write the book, and why now, given this long career of yours and analysis on issues linked to social equity, the role of the state and others. So why the book and why now?
Okay. So first of all, thanks so much both to the foundation, to the publisher, and to you, Manuel, who's actually taken the time to read it. I mean, look at this. He's actually read it. What's amazing with Kindle is you can tell how much people have read, apparently, and it's public data. And apparently with Piketty's book, only 6% of the book has been read. But this looks like I'm beating Piketty. It's all been read. Anyway, so I think there's different reasons, and I'll just name two. This is really loud. Is this normal? It's fine? You don't hear everything I'm doing, like breathing and sneezing? Okay, so first, I was quite struck after the Labour Party lost the election in the UK in 2015, that the analysis literally the day after was we lost, we meaning they were saying, Tony Blair wrote an article, even though he was no longer in government for a while, we lost, the Labour Party lost because we didn't embrace the wealth creators. And by that they meant business. And I just thought, you know, what have we come to when even the Labour Party, you know, the word Labour is in the party's name, doesn't have a real kind of complex and collective understanding of where wealth and where value come from, because they actually meant business. They thought they lost because they didn't embrace the entrepreneurs. And similarly, so much of the inequality that Piketty talks about, the guy who wrote the book that people have only read 6% of, if you look at the actual data that he presents and the particular types of problematic taxation systems, which he also blames for the rise in inequality, for example, very low capital gains tax, which he kind of dissects in terms of its effect on inequality, what I was very interested in is why did that happen? What were the stories, the narratives, the lobbying efforts that occurred when these taxation changes occurred? Because in my experience, in looking at the innovation economy, so many of the kind of stupid things that happen are often done in the name of wealth creation. So, for example, the patent box, which is a policy I don't tire telling governments to get rid of because it makes no sense. Patents are already, 20-year, they're giving companies 20-year monopoly profits. You don't have to reduce the taxation on a 20-year monopoly. Actually occurred through narratives and storytelling that, in that case, the pharmaceutical industry has told governments of what will actually incentivize value creation in the sector. And so this kind of capture of the narrative about value by few interests, I just wanted to kind of open it up and bring value back to the way that not just the economics profession talks to itself, because value has kind of left economics departments and gone to business schools, where they talk about shareholder value, value chains, shared value, but also really bring it back as an area to be contested so that value extraction is harder to do in the name of value creation. Let me just repeat that. There is nothing necessarily new about value extraction. In the book, I go through all the diagnosis in the 1700s and in the 1800s where different types of economists were talking about it. What's new in the modern era is that value extraction occurs in the name of value creation. So the landlords in the 1700s didn't pretend to be really funky, cool, creative, and innovative. They just said, give me your money. And that's why Adam Smith said rent equals robbery. Anyway, so that's why I wrote the book, to really bring value back to be kind of an area that people also feel quite free and knowledgeable to debate, not necessarily agreeing. And lastly, I'll just finish by saying that I also begin the book with a quote by Plato, who's not a stupid guy, wasn't a stupid guy, who said that storytellers rule the world. And again, coming back to this point I just made about Piketty, the degree to which the stories that we're actually telling about value are actually one of the more interesting but less understood sources of the inequality that so many countries are experiencing. I wanted to, if you want, unveil those stories. And so I begin with one quote of such a story from Goldman Sachs, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, saying that Goldman Sachs workers are the most productive, the most valuable workers in the world. And I kind of unpicked how confident he could be to say that, given how we talk about value.
Let's stay on the topic of value for just a minute, and maybe a couple of questions on this, because I think this is the sort of the heart of the thesis and what you're putting forward. And in fact, I think it's the more transformative and structural element perhaps within the whole book is this idea, we need to reopen the debate about where value lies in the economy, who's productive and who's really contributing value and who's extracting value. And that, where you draw that line has enormous implications, and how you set the concept of value, right? So two questions so that we can all know you're thinking about this is, how have you seen that evolution of value, and perhaps just focus on the last bit that you find so problematic on price equals value, and markets determining the price based on marginal utility, in fact, then determining value. And how does that differ from capture and rent capture? And how do you perimeter the notion of rent? Because I think that's the narrative that you're wanting to reopen, right? The discussion that you want to throw out there.
Yeah. Can I just say one thing about the book in Spanish? Because, and it's not a criticism, don't worry, about the publisher, but, they say don't judge a book by its cover. But actually, the Spanish version has two major differences with the English version. And it's kind of good because it gives us something to talk about. But one has to do with what you just said, which is here it says, Quién produce y quién gana. But I purposefully, in the English version, said don't write who takes, who makes, because it's a static question. It's a question that you say, finance is bad, bad hedge funds, bad credit default swaps, bad derivatives, good industry, which is not true given just how financialized also industry has become. So the idea is by putting it into a verb, so not who takes, who makes, but making and taking, it gives a sense actually that we can change things. I just want to say that because you yourself just said, in your thesis you talk about who creates, who makes, and it's interesting that in some cases that was the big debate. So Adam Smith, in trying to actually differentiate the makers and the takers, literally made a list of professions that he thought were actually producing value and those he thought weren't. So just to answer the question, what I find very interesting is that basically how we've thought about value has always coincided with some strong structural features of the economy, right? So in the 1600s, the mercantilists focused on trade as kind of the source of value. Similar, by the way, to Trump today, worrying so much about terms of trade. In the 1600s, they had the navigation acts, so they really thought the terms of trade and exchange rate really mattered to value. In the 1700s, agricultural economy, it's not a coincidence that they thought that farm labor was very important, and the physiocrats even had this word of the sterile class. They were very worried if the sterile class, who they thought were the landlords, were siphoning out so much value from the economy, from the value that was produced by the farmers, that the system wouldn't reproduce itself, right? So these words like sterility in reproduction. And the classical economists writing in the 1800s, not a coincidence that they looked at labor as a source of value because that was the period of the Industrial Revolution. And so Adam Smith, you might remember if you read The Wealth of Nations, focused a lot on the division of labor, the effect that had on productivity, on growth, and the wealth of nations. So what's interesting is both in the case of the physiocrats in the 1700s and the classical economists, they really had a notion of value that was objective. And by objective, I mean they actually looked at production and changes in production like organizational change, technological change, and from that actually derived sort of a theory of exchange. The big revolution that occurred in modern economic thought was that the attention became much more based on subjective features. So the idea that different agents are, have preferences, subjective preferences, and they're maximizing different choices, individual choices. So consumers maximizing utility or happiness, for those who don't want to go into complexities, firms maximizing profits, workers maximizing their preferences for leisure versus work. This big change, revolution that occurred in the history of economic thought from objective to subjective understandings of value, first of all, is unknown by most economic students because we don't, I don't know how it is in where you teach, but we don't really teach different theories of value in the history of economic thought anymore, and that's part of the loss of this debate. But also, by going to this overly subjective emphasis, I argue that actually made it much harder to differentiate value extraction from value creation, rents from profits. Because actually the emphasis before was on a theory of value that determined price, and all of a sudden what we have today is really a theory of price, supply and demand curves, marginal utility curves, which then determine a theory of value. So we only, for example, include into GDP those things that have a price. That's actually how we look at value, price as revealing value. And both of these issues, which is, that there was actually this big sort of debate about value and the word value was used, whereas today it's literally just Econ 101. We don't present marginal utility theory as a theory of value. It's just economics. And the fact that this subjective emphasis makes it harder to confront the big question that both the classicals and the physiocrats asked, which is, well, what is the difference between kind of creating new high-quality goods and services versus just moving existing stuff around? When we subjectify value, that difference becomes much harder to make. And so, surprise, surprise, much of what today is in GDP, so how we measure the total output of what nations produce, I believe actually is rent, but we don't really know how to make that distinction. And so one last thing about rent. In the classical economists, rent was literally about unearned income. Because they focused on production and the division of labor and the different actors who made stuff, and some owned the means of production and some didn't, etc., they had this idea that rent itself was different from profits, and it was literally just moving stuff around and charging money for it. Whereas in modern economic thought, rent is basically just an imperfection towards a competitive price, which in theory can be competed away. So there's no longer also this kind of idea that there's some activities that maybe are literally just moving things around, but somehow extracting value. And I think we might come back to that point later when we look at the digital economy, but that itself is a fundamental difference which has sort of escaped many modern, even progressive theorists like Stiglitz himself. For him, rent is sort of a competitiveness problem. It's monopoly power versus unearned income.
But just so that people understand, I think maybe this was my reading. I was trying to wrap my head around this issue because it's deeply, it's almost revolutionary in the sense that, we think that throughout the production process of something, there are different inputs in that process, and the value of these inputs is calculated on the basis of price, right? So imagine you've worked on, the concept of the iPhone and how it's produced and where it comes from. So normally what you would say is the final price and value of the iPhone is what people are willing to pay for it. The cost is the addition of the cost of inputs, and that cost of inputs was calculated on the basis of market pricing, right? So you bought this material. There was somebody in China that participated in this production process. Throughout that entire chain, the market is operating and is setting prices, and in principle is setting value. Now, the narrative that you're suggesting basically means that is an imperfect system because we're missing to a large extent the real value of things, which should be assessed objectively, so outside of market mechanisms. I mean, you can contest this, but this is my reading of the book. So how do we apply this practically, right? Does that mean that we go into the totality of these processes and we say, oh, hold on, actually this input in Malaysia, this man or woman working in this process is underpaid because objectively that has far more value than the market price of hiring that person. So is the consequence of opening this thesis and actually this questioning, is the consequence, if we take it to its final implications, a very large-scale intervention of productive processes to control market mechanisms and to limit their value attribution through price? I mean, maybe this is taking it too far, but in essence, I think the narrative is fascinating because all of us, I'm sure, have these questions in our minds. You know, why is a neurosurgeon paid 20 times less than a defender from Real Madrid, right? Or why, you mentioned in the book the water and diamonds example. Objectively, these things have different utility, but when you look at the price, if price is value, we're saying, you know, diamonds are far more valuable than water just based on supply and demand. So if we take the market out, who determines this, and how does the economy look? Because it looks highly intervened, doesn't it? I mean, I just don't know how this is applied in a practical sense.
So first of all, I mean, one thing that I do actually in both books, Entrepreneurial State, so El Estado Emprendedor, and this one, is kind of redefine even what we mean by the word market. Often we confuse the word market with business. The market, if you read someone who influenced me a lot, it's Karl Polanyi, a historian who was writing in the 30s and 40s, the market is an outcome of how public, private, and third sector, including trade unions, interact, right? Without trade unions, we wouldn't have weekends. We wouldn't have the 8-hour workday. Those struggles actually formed modern-day markets. So we have to be very careful not to confuse the word business sector with the market and how government actually operates, how it regulates, how it invests, how it is structured, itself determines also how, you know, what kind of markets we get. Of course, the business sector as well. That's why we have business schools where we study all these interesting questions of how private companies behave. But so as soon as you kind of start with that point, we then have to sort of back off and say, well, what do we even mean by sort of market prices and the free market? And by the way, for Adam Smith, the free market was not free from the state. It was free from rent. This is very interesting because you have Adam Smithians all over the world, the Adam Smith Institute in the UK, which basically predicates itself on this notion that we need as small of a state as possible. But actually to limit rent-seeking of different types, you need sort of an active, also confident state. But in the book, what I do is not so much kind of go into the deep, you know, discussions of exactly how also market prices come about and whether they are or not related to costs. I mean, I could have done that, and that would have opened a whole sort of Marxist debate about that issue. What I do is actually ask the first question that you asked, which I probably didn't answer, which is, who cares? You know, who cares about this whole debate? What does it actually mean for sort of the common person? And what I do is I break it down into sort of different implications. One is it completely affects how we measure output, not just in the ways that feminists for years have been arguing is problematic because we only include areas that have prices, so care is not included, or environmentalists, you know, have told us when we pollute, GDP goes up. If you marry your cleaner, GDP goes down. But also literally in how we have or have not been able to really account for one of the biggest changes in terms of output in modern-day economies, which is the emergence of the financial sector. It's outpacing, in some ways, of the real economy. What happened up until 1970 was that it was really just seen as a transfer of existing income from one place to another. So most of the financial sector was not even included in GDP. And then you had the people doing the national accounts inside the UN. They were called, the group was SNA, the Systems of National Accounts, who just started seeing this kind of blob growing in terms of the data they had access to and said, we better start including this. But instead of pausing and saying, what kind of finance is growing? What is its actual value that it's contributing to in the economy? They literally just gave it a name. So specifically what I'm talking about is the net interest payments, so the difference between what banks earn in interest when they give you a loan and what they give out when you have a deposit, that difference, net interest payments, was not included in GDP because it was seen as a transfer in the same ways that, say, welfare benefits are not included. And what was very interesting, and this is sort of what I point to as a problem in how we currently think about value, is they just kind of gave it a name to include it. Because on the national income and product accounting, you have to give sort of the name of what is the service, what is the good that's being provided by an activity. So they called the investment banks providing of risk-taking services and commercial banks as financial intermediation, and then applied the net interest payments being earned by these two different types of banks into GDP, without actually asking what exactly is the banking sector doing. And what we now know, for the last 30 years, a big chunk of the financial sector, in terms of the funds that it distributes, has basically just gone back into the financial sector itself. So in the UK, something like 90% of finance, it's a huge number in the UK, just gets plowed back into finance, insurance, and real estate. It conveniently, the acronym is FIRE. It's supposed to scare you, like Greta. No, the house is on fire, literally. And only 10% finds its way into the real economy. So the question is, should we, when we are looking at accounting, also be asking some fundamental questions, as the classicals did, as the physiocrats did? Is value being siphoned out of the system? Is it becoming, are there sterile classes, if you want that, or sterile activities that are siphoning funds out? And is this putting at risk the reproductiveness? So anyway, so how we do accounting, how we think about corporate governance is also a huge implication. So you might have heard big debates internationally about the problems that occur when companies maximize shareholder value. There's been critiques about how that leads to too much speculation, too much short-termism, but then nothing really changes. And so I argue that that's because the underlying value, theory of value in that practice, when companies are just worried about their share prices, hasn't really been debunked. And so if we pause and bring a bit of an objective thinking to how we are producing, what the different activities are, and bring forth a collective understanding of value, different actors, what's really interesting when you look at the justification of maximizing shareholder value is it's underpinned by a very problematic notion of who the risk takers are in the economy. So the idea that shareholders are the biggest risk takers, what we call the residual claimants, only when everyone else has been paid their guaranteed rate of return, they have, access to the booty left over at the end. That itself, which has justified practices, which I talk about in the book, as extractive, so just using your profits to buy back your shares, is founded on a very problematic notion of who the value creators are, because this idea that only the shareholders are the real risk takers because they don't have a guaranteed rate of return is just faulty. So if we want to criticize that practice of maximizing shareholder value, we have to debunk the underlying assumptions about value on which it is resting, as opposed to just look at the symptoms, like short-termism. And so, in any sort of area, if you look at the amount of risk that is being taken on, whether it's by the state or workers in many different areas, that should be, if you want, mapped. It should be documented. We should understand who's doing what. The financial sector itself, of course, is important, but often the rewards it's reaping are much greater than the actual risks taken. So for me, this is really important. This is sort of the objective, which is to bring forth a framework, but also ideally a quantitative analysis of who is doing what are the risks being taken, and how are they or not proportionate to the rewards that are being earned. So as opposed to saying venture capital is terrible, of course it's not. The degree to which it's earning from a process that is much greater than the actual risks that they're taking on in the industry becomes an interesting way to sort of document the degree to which value is being extracted in that particular activity.
You raise a ton of issues there that I hope we can address sort of in a more sliced fashion in a few questions. But just to follow up on this, so what would your definition of capture be? I mean, sort of, which practices, or how would you perimeter this? Because it's so vital, because this is what we want to expel from the economy. And who gets to determine that? I mean, because that's another question. I mean, one of the benefits of these market mechanisms is that, in principle, you're decentralizing this. This is a supply and demand issue. The objective way of doing this begs the question, who does this and how, right? So how would you define capture, and who is tasked with identifying it and expelling it from the economy, right? Eliminating it from the economy.
So this is, a really important question, but let me just come back to that Plato quote of storytellers rule the world. When Blankfein said Goldman Sachs workers are the most productive in the world, teachers in public schools in countries that have free education literally can't say it in terms of how we do the accounting, right? Because how we actually measure output, for example, of a free education system, we only in GDP include the costs of the teachers. So the salaries of the teachers goes into GDP, but the actual value that's created from a well-funded, well-structured public education system is not. So this is related to the question, because if we cannot even measure some things, then this degree of capture is actually impossible to document. So the first thing is to be able to actually document what is valuable, what is not. And here I go back to the point of that feminist economists have been arguing for a very long time that so many fundamental areas of the economy are not even valued because of our focus just on price. And again, the environmental economists. But the degree to which this then requires also understanding that so much of the actual capture, for example, the financial sector, the degree to which the investment banks are earning so much more than what they are actually, if you want, producing in the system in terms of value added, is related also to the level of confidence in some ways that they have. So this kind of level of security and self-confidence that the financial sector has is completely mismeasured compared to what they are actually, if you want, producing. And the reason I mentioned this issue of confidence and self-security, if you want, is that in many ways, the degree to which then some of these regressive practices, which have rewarded value extraction over value creation, have been done not necessarily through economic means, right? So when I mentioned the patent box, which was lobbied for by very particular stories being told by the sector, that's not something that is only then able to be documented by economists, right? You need to better understand why it is that the same civil servants inside the state who perhaps know in particular countries the value of public sector activity, say in the health sector, then just give into and believe the stories that they're being told to, say, by the pharmaceutical industry. Or in the case of the capital gains tax that I mentioned, it was a particular thing that happened in history where the National Venture Capital Association lobbied for a capital gains tax to fall by 40% in just 5 years. They were able to do that back in the 1970s. That itself requires sort of understanding, if you want, the power of their ability as a sector to take over the imagination of society of their role. And this is what I think economists have much less to say about than, say, sociologists and philosophers who have this interesting notion of performativity. So how we judge the performance of a sector affects how that sector behaves, and it feeds back into how we understand how that, what that sector's role is in the economy. So it becomes this kind of vicious cycle if we don't have ways to measure the value of something.
So basically, you launch the narrative, the debate, and that has huge implications for the way we conceive, in fact, income and others. And then there are multiple implications for this across sectors and others. Now, you have an argument in the book. Let's just turn the page on the more, I think, on the theory and the narrative, and some cases that you bring up. You have the case of the financial sector and your concern in your chapter. In Spanish, it's called the casino economy. I don't know if that's the title in English as well. But basically, this idea of you have this whole argument about the overexpansion of the financial sector, the capture of rent by the financial sector, and the financialization of the economy. So I was wondering if you could just share with us, why do you think this process is occurring, and if it's exclusively linked to that narrative piece of it, or there are other elements in there, and how do you think this should be tackled in particular? I mean, this issue of the performance and functioning of the financial sector.
So in the book, I talk about financialization in two different ways. One is the financialization of the financial sector itself, and that's the issue of financing finance. And the other is the financialization of industry. So the degree to which profits in industry, by that I mean the real economy, are not being reinvested back into the economy. So in Europe, we have 2 trillion euros just being hoarded, but 3 trillion dollars worth being used by the Fortune 500 companies in the last 10 years just to buy back their own shares to boost stock options and, surprise, surprise, executive pay. Now, both of these practices are sort of the twin areas of financialization. And what's interesting is it's not just the narrative. We are literally rewarding that kind of behavior. And I don't think that's unlinked to, I mean, obviously it's linked to all sorts of dynamics that others have written about, like deregulation. But again, this practice of maximization of shareholder value that I mentioned before, which really only started to take hold in the 1980s, is what also, if you want, justifies that particular practice of share buybacks. And that, by the way, is one of the key, I think, sources of the problems we're facing today around workers' wages, their skills, and different issues around the workplace, which are unfortunately often discussed in terms of the power of the robots, right? Technology is somehow taking away work. There's worries about AI and big data, its effect on employment and the level of wages. And if you look back in history, David Ricardo already in 1821, when he was writing, and I talk a lot about David Ricardo, was already worried about this problem. He wrote a chapter called On Machinery in 1821 in his book, Principles of Political Economy, and basically said, oh dear, we have a problem. All this mechanization, so during the Industrial Revolution, is taking people's jobs. We're going to have a problem with wages, which then Marx also looked at in terms of the effect on profits, given that he thought that labor was the main source of surplus value. So as you get mechanization, his question was actually what's going to happen to profits. But if you look at then what happened for 200 years after Ricardo first posed the question, literally the mechanization question, was that profits in one part of the economy, which were being generated by increased mechanization, which was labor displacing, because mechanization in the history of capitalism has almost always been labor displacing. As long as those profits were reinvested in another part of the economy, then new jobs were created elsewhere. And so in some ways, this lack of reinvestment, which we see, which is occurring because of this financialization of industry in modern-day capitalism, that is one of the biggest sources of the problems we have today with wages and skills, because skills aren't just formed through government training programs. They're also formed inside companies as an endogenous effect of investment.
And what would you change in this sector, if you could? I mean, what do you think, what are the measures here that would make it, that would bring it closer to value creation?
I think there's sort of different ones. One, in terms of what I was just talking about, what's interesting is that precisely because value is actually created collectively through different types of actors, public, private, third sector, when the public sector does play a role in the economy, as it does, for good or for bad, we can talk about that later, the fact that there's so few conditions attached to that public support of business, and that could be both through guarantees and subsidies, which I'm not a huge fan of, but especially the investments that the public sector makes. So in the entrepreneurial state, I look at all the investments that occurred in Silicon Valley should actually be conditional on reinvestment of profits, investments in skills, also the nature, for example, of the patent system today, which is really being abused because patents are too wide, too strong, too upstream. There should be stronger conditionality. And by the way, this used to happen. So one of the most innovative private sector R&D laboratories was Bell Labs, which you might have heard about. There's a great book on it, The Ideas Factory, a very important private R&D laboratory which was fundamental to the IT revolution. That came about in an era where government was much more confident of kind of proclaiming its role in creating value and forced AT&T to reinvest its profits in order to retain its monopoly status. And so conditionality is one way to also limit the degree to which profits are not being reinvested back in, because these companies are not atomistic sole entrepreneurs working in whatever sector. Their own profits are the outcomes of a social infrastructure, but also collective value creation, which should be then reflected in sort of what, if you want, happens to the profits, not in a micromanaged way, but at least in terms of this level of reinvestment. And on the financial side, on the financial sector, it's quite extraordinary that even the basic stuff that could have been done hasn't been done, like the financial transaction tax, which would have rewarded long-term investments over short-term ones. But a more structural idea is, what sort of new types of financial institutions, what is the financial ecosystem that we actually require to get us long-term growth? So what's interesting is, for example, in the U.S., they would have never been able to have the Silicon Valley, if you want, story without patient, long-term finance that was coming from particular types of organizations inside the U.S. government. But some countries, for example, have public banks. And increasingly with the green transition around the world, public banks are playing a very important role. So in some countries, we just don't have them. So one question is, do we think about new types of financial institutions like public banks? But the real issue is, how do we devise them? How do we actually structure these new financial institutions so that they really exhibit or, illustrate the real power of the public? So it's not just handouts. It's not a public bank just giving out money to the sector that asks for money the most, which I would argue is its self-capture. But actually the public sector, through something like a public bank, really trying to achieve additionality, making things happen that wouldn't have anyway. So being what I call more mission-oriented, more strategic, making these long-term investments, which then crowd in private finance. But we have too few of those banks, and when we do have them, they are not really driven by a notion of public value because, surprise, surprise, we don't even have that word in economics.
The experience in Spain with public banks, I mean, we had these cajas, in Spain that were run, that had strong connections with the public sector, is mixed at best. They engaged in some practices to some extent, engaging in lending, and others to high-risk folks and people with connections to these banks. So I think the key to that issue must surely be on the governance and how you execute the proposal, because it can suffer from greater vices than the ones that you have identified in some parts of the financial sector. But my question is different. I have another question, which is, I was scanning through the book, and you have this sort of atomic bomb of an idea, which is we're not attributing value properly, and market mechanisms fail at doing this across the productive processes and others. But when I look at the solutions that you put forward, forcing the financial or incentivizing the financial sector to focus on long-term gains, encouraging firms to focus more on benefit, and this idea of reducing the centrality of shareholder value and adding others like benefit corporations, B Corps. I mean, this idea of you have to think more about the social impact of your activity, capping executive pay, changing the patent law, capping medicine costs, rethinking taxation for platforms and others. You mentioned the Green New Deal and others. I mean, that at the end seems to me like a social democrat program of curtailing some of the issues that you find problematic in the market, and many people do, no? So how do these two things match, right? Because on the one hand, you basically have a social democratic economic program, but on the other, you have this really much larger idea that there's something fundamentally rotten in the way that we define value? Is it because you think that unless we change that definition, these ideas are never going to hold a majority of, the majority support in public opinion? I mean, is there something, because there are people putting these ideas forward, they're just not getting into government, right? Including the Labour Party in the UK. We'll see what happens in the next few months. But, how do these things coexist?
Right. So I think what you're saying is, hold on, you have this really revolutionary analysis, but then the solutions are a bit like, whatever, heard them before, even without debunking the value thing.
And in many cases, they haven't managed to mobilize enough people to constitute a program of government, right?
The last time this happened, someone sent me a note saying, your babysitter's calling because there's something wrong at home. So I'm like, oh, no. But luckily, this is your
I have somebody from the Polytechnic University, so I'm sure it's not the babysitter.
So I would argue that it's wrong. Okay, so first of all, the social democratic policies for redistribution are extremely important, and they're not necessarily they're not being done in ambitious kind of creative ways today. One of the points that I make in the book is that will never be enough unless we actually have a way as progressives, let's just assume that everyone in this room defines themselves as a progressive, to talk about the creation of wealth, not just its redistribution. We're not going to win the argument. And this is one of my critiques, or not critiques, one of my arguments with the work, again, of Piketty is that you can't read that whole book and just have as a solution tax the wealth. If we don't actually debunk where that wealth came from in the first place, no taxation system will ever be resilient. It'll be very easy to undo in the next kind of election round. And so just taking the examples you gave with kind of, data and, the questions of, is this just about getting long-term finance or taxing this, that, the other, I would argue that the real solutions that would be lasting and not just constantly changing and depending on which kind of minister comes in, but actually really have a resonance, a legitimacy in society because it starts to change how people view, again, the question, where does wealth come from, have a lot to do with this kind of question of debunking value. In the case of data, I'll just give 3 quick examples. What is currently happening in the city of Barcelona, I think, is really interesting because there, the point is not, let's just tax the digital companies or let's just, privacy and they come in afterwards, retroactively reacting to a problem of the data inside the companies, but actually questioning why do these companies have the data in the first place? Can we not fundamentally think of new institutional and organizational structures so the data that's generated when you click on Citymapper actually comes back also to the city to improve, say, its public transport. And that, if it was just a policy out of the blue, would be one thing. But if it's tied to, again, a narrative and understanding in society that it's wrong that companies which didn't even produce the technology that's used to retrieve the data, and the data is of the citizens, but somehow get all the data, that's fundamentally wrong. So it's not just about taxing the wealth that they create, the wealth that they earn when they get access to the data. It's questioning why do they have the data, this free access to this data in the first place. And that can only be done as a serious conversation involving civil society as opposed to just, top-down kind of, new policy coming in either from a mayor or a benign dictator or a new ministry. If this question of where does value actually come is created in a much more collective way than we have been fed is had. Similar in the pharmaceutical industry, if we just say, the prices are so high, that's unfair, people die, not much happens. Only if we start to ask, how can it be that we've accepted this formula of value-based pricing, which is basically to allow prices to go in that sector to what the market will bear. That's basically what value-based pricing is. So when, I think it was just 2 months ago, the price of an antibiotic went up by 400% overnight, and the head of the company, Nostrum Pharmaceuticals, said, we have the moral imperative to allow the prices to go what the market will bear. One reaction is just like, oh my God, that's terrible, but nothing will change if we just worry about the social democratic response of that's not fair. If we say, how can it be that the pharmaceutical companies have such power on the prices of goods that have been created collectively, and in this case, to be honest, with kind of like 70 or 80% of public money, that is what then allows you to really debunk that system. Similarly, when Obama finally introduced, after decades of the U.S. government trying to bring kind of public health insurance to the U.S., because 60 million people were uninsured in the U.S. before Obamacare, when he was attacked by the Tea Party, and they said, how dare you meddle, interfere in our healthcare system, he only gave the social democratic response. He said, of course, it's unfair that 60 million people are uninsured. What he should have said is, meddling? What are you talking about? We co-created that healthcare system. 75% of new molecular entities with priority ratings, so the really important drugs, are publicly financed worldwide. So this kind of co-creation, co-shaping, not just fixing, story and transforming it also into an economic framework, because if you think of it, policy and economic theory is just there to fix a market failure as opposed to co-create and co-shape the market. That is revolutionary, actually, in terms of bringing a new sort of legitimacy and understanding in the population of what the role is of these different actors. And lastly, the shareholder value example I already gave, as I said, it's not enough to just look at the consequences of maximizing shareholder value. You have to debunk the underlying notion of the shareholders being the biggest risk takers and the only ones without a guaranteed rate of return. Then, if we really get that understanding out, it'll be much easy to have a long-lasting sort of attack on that practice versus just it's unfair. It creates short-termism. It creates, problems in the economy.